mere enumeration of government activity is evidence, often the sole evidence offered, of inadequate, non-government institutions whose inability to cope with problems obviously required state intervention. Government is depicted as acting not in response to its own political incentives and constraints, but because it is compelled to do so by concerns for the public interest. It cannot keep its hands off when so much is at stake, when emergency compels it to supersede other decision-making processes. Such a tableau simply ignores the possibility that there are political incentives for the production and distribution of emergencies to justify expansions of power, as well as to use episodic emergencies as a reason for creating enduring government institutions. Despite widespread misconceptions in the United States today that the institution of slavery was based on race for most of the thousands of years in which slavery existed around the world, it was based on whoever was vulnerable to enslavement and within striking distance. Thus, Europeans enslaved other Europeans just as Asians enslaved other Asians, and Africans enslaved other Africans, while Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. The very word slave derived from the word of Slavs, who were enslaved by fellow Europeans for centuries before Africans began to be brought in chains to the Western Hemisphere. Africans were not singled out by a race for ownership by Europeans. They were resorted to after the rise of nation-states with armies and navies in other parts of the world, which reduced the number of places that could be raided for slaves without great cost and risks. Slave raiding continued in Africa primarily by Africans enslaving other Africans, and then in West Africa selling some of their slaves to whites to take the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the growing range of ships and the growing wealth of nations eventually made economically feasible the transportation of vast numbers of slaves from one continent to another, creating racial differences between the enslaved and their owners as a dominant pattern in the Western Hemisphere. Such a pattern was by no means limited to Europeans owning non-Europeans. However, there were many examples of the reverse, quite aside from the vast regions of Earth where neither the slaves nor their owners were either black or white. White liberals, instead of comparing what has happened to the black family since the liberal welfare state policies of the 1960s were put into practice, compare black families to white families and conclude that the higher rate of broken homes and unwed motherhood among blacks are due to a legacy of slavery. But why the large-scale disintegration of the black family should have begun 100 years after slavery is left unexplained. Whatever the situation of the black family relative to the white family in the past or the present, it is clear that broken homes were far more common among blacks at the end of the 20th century than they were in the middle of that century or at the beginning of that century, even though blacks at the beginning of the 20th century were just one generation out of slavery. The widespread casual abandonment of their children and of the women who bore them by black fathers in the ghettos of the late 20th century was in fact a painfully ironic contrast with what had happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery 100 years earlier. When observers in the South reported desperate efforts of freed blacks to find family members who had been separated from them during the era of slavery. What was peculiar about the West was not that it participated in the worldwide evil of slavery, but that it later abolished that evil, not only in Western societies, but also in other societies subject to Western control or influence. This was possible only because the anti-slavery movement coincided with an era in which Western power and homogeny were at their zenith, so that it was essentially European imperialism which ended slavery. This idea might seem shocking, not because it does not fit the facts, but because it does not fit the prevailing vision of our time. If we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we could compare the hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with the hard evidence on the legacy of liberals. Despite the grand myth that black economic progress began or accelerated with the passage of the civil rights laws and war on poverty programs of the 1960s, the cold fact is that poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% by 1960. This was before any of those programs began. Over the next 20 years, the poverty rate among blacks fell another 18 percentage points compared to the 40-point drop in the previous 20 years. This was the continuation of a previous economic trend at a slower rate of progress, not the economic grand deliverance proclaimed by liberals and self-serving black leaders. Nearly 100 years of the supposed legacy of slavery found most black children, 78% of which, being raised in two-parent families in the 1960s. But 30 years after the liberal welfare state found the great majority of black children being raised by a single parent, 66%, public housing projects in the first half of the 20th century were clean, safe places where people slept outside on hot summer nights when they were too poor to afford air conditioning. That was before admission standards for public housing projects were lowered or abandoned. In the euphoria of liberal non-judgmental notions, and it was before the toxic message of victimhood was spread by liberals. We all know what hellholes public housing has become in our time. The same toxic message produced similar social results among lower-income people in England, despite an absence of a legacy of slavery there. If we are to go by evidence of social retrogression, liberals have wreaked more havoc on blacks than the supposed legacy of slavery they talk about. External explanations of black-white differences, discrimination, or poverty, for example, seem to many to be more amenable to public policy than internal explanations such as culture. Those with this point of view tend to resist cultural explanations, but there is yet another reason why some resist understanding the counterproductive effects of an anachronistic culture. Alternative explanations of economic and social lags provide a more satisfying ability to blame all such lags on the sins of others, such as racism or discrimination. Equally important, such external explanations require no painful internal changes in the black population, but leave all changes to whites, who are seen as needing to be harangued, threatened, or otherwise forced to change. In short, prevailing explanations provide an alibi for those who lag, and an alibi is for many an enormously valuable asset that they are unlikely to give up easily. Talk about how various people have been winners in the lottery of life, or have things that others don't have just because they happen to have money, is part of the delegitimizing of property as a prelude to seizing it. Luck certainly plays a very large role in all our lives, but we need to be very clear about what that role is. Very few people just happen to have money. Typically, they have it because their fellow human beings have voluntarily paid them for providing some goods or services which are valued more than the money that is paid for them. It is not a zero-sum game. Both sides are better off because of it, and the whole society is better off when such transactions take place freely among free and independent people. Who can better decide the value of the goods and services that someone has produced than the people who actually use those goods and services and pay for them with their own hard-earned money? Luck may well have played a role in enabling some people to provide valuable goods and services. Others might have been able to do the same if they had been raised by better parents, taught in better schools, or chanced upon someone who pointed them in the right direction. But you are not going to change that by confiscating the fruits of productivity. All you are likely to do is reduce that productivity and undermine the virtues and attitudes that create prosperity and make a free society possible. The history of black workers in the United States illustrates the point. As already noted, from the late 19th century on through the middle of the 20th century, the labor force participation rate of American blacks was slightly higher than that of the American whites. In other words, blacks were just as employable at the wages they received as whites were at their very different wages. The minimum wage law changed that. Before federal minimum wage laws were instituted in the 1930s, the black unemployment rate was slightly lower than the white unemployment rate of the 1930s, but then followed the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, all of which imposed government-mandated minimum wages, either on a particular sector or more broadly. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which promoted unionization, also tended to price black workers out of jobs, in addition to union rules that kept blacks from jobs by barring them from union membership. The National Industrial Recovery Act raised wage rates in the southern textile industry by 70% in just 5 months, and its impact nationwide was estimated to have cost blacks 500,000 jobs. While this act was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was upheld by the High Court and became the major force establishing a national minimum wage. As already noted, the inflation of the 1940s largely nullified the effect of the Fair Labor Standards Act until it was amended in 1950 to raise minimum wages to a level that would have some actual effect on current wages. By 1954, black unemployment rates were double those of whites and have continued to be at that level or higher. Those particularly hard hit by the resulting unemployment have been black teenage males. Even though 1949, the year before a series of minimum wage escalations began, was a recession year, black teenage male unemployment that year was lower than it was to be at any time during the later boom years of the 1960s. The wide gap between the unemployment rates of black and white teenagers dates from the escalation of the minimum wage and the spread of its coverage in the 1950s. The usual explanations of high unemployment among black teenagers, inexperience, less education, lack of skills, racism, cannot explain their rising unemployment, since all of these things were worse during the earlier period when black teenage unemployment was much lower. Taking the more normal year of 1948 as a basis for comparison, black male teenage unemployment then was less than half of what it would be at any time during the decade of the 1960s, and less than 1/3 of what it would be in the 1970s. Unemployment among 16 and 17-year-old black males was no higher than among white males of the same age in 1948. It was only after a series of minimum wage escalations began that black male teenage unemployment not only skyrocketed, but became more than double the unemployment rates among white male teenagers. In the early 21st century, the unemployment rate for black teenagers exceeded 30%. After the American economy turned down in the wake of the housing and financial crisis, unemployment among black teenagers reached 40%. A very distinct pattern has emerged repeatedly when policies favored by the anointed turn out to fail. This pattern typically has 4 stages. Stage 1, the crisis. Some situation exists whose negative aspects the anointed propose to eliminate. Such a situation is routinely characterized as a crisis, even though all human situations have negative aspects, and even though evidence is seldom asked or given to show how the situation at hand is either uniquely bad or threatening to get worse. Sometimes the situation described as a crisis has in fact already been getting better for years. Stage 2, the solution. Policies to end the crisis are advocated by the anointed, who say that these policies will lead to beneficial results. Critics say that these policies will lead to detrimental results. The anointed dismiss these later claims as absurd and simplistic, if not dishonest. Stage 3, the results. The policies are instituted and led to detrimental results. Stage 4, the response. Those who attribute detrimental results to the policies instituted are dismissed as simplistic for ignoring the complexities involved, as many factors went into determining the outcome. The burden of proof is put on the critics to demonstrate to a certainty that these policies alone were the only possible cause of the worsening that occurred. No burden of proof whatever is put on those who had so confidently predicted improvement. Indeed, it is often asserted that these things would have been even worse were it not for the wonderful programs that mitigated the inevitable damage from other factors. Examples of this pattern are all too abundant. 3 will be considered here. The first and most general involves the set of social welfare policies called the War on Poverty, during the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson, but continuing under other labels since then. Next is the policy of introducing sex education into the public schools as a means of reducing teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. The third example will be policies designed to reduce crime by adopting a less punitive approach, being more concerned with preventative social policies beforehand and rehabilitation afterwards, as well as showing more concern with the legal rights of defendants in criminal cases. One of the many signs of verbal virtuosity among intellectuals is the repackaging of words to mean things that are not only different from, but sometimes the direct opposite of, their original meanings. Freedom and power are among the most common of these repackaged words. The basic concept of freedom as not being subjected to other people's restrictions, and of power as the ability to restrict other people's options, have both been stood on their heads in some of the repackaging of these words by intellectuals discussing economic issues. Thus, business enterprises who expand the public options, either quantitatively through lower prices or qualitatively through better products, are often spoken of as controlling the market. Whenever this results in a high percentage of consumers choosing to purchase their particular products rather than the competing products of other enterprises. In other words, when consumers decide that particular brands of products are either cheaper or better than competing brands of those products, third parties take it upon themselves to depict those who produce these particular brands as having exercised power or control. If, at a given time, 3/4 of consumers prefer to buy the Acme brand of widgets to any other brand, then Acme Inc. will be said to control 3/4 of the market, even though consumers control 100% of the market, since they can switch to another brand of widgets tomorrow if someone else comes up with a better widget, or stop buying widgets altogether if a new product comes along that makes widgets obsolete. By saying that businesses have power because they have control of their markets, this verbal virtuosity opens the way to saying that government needs to exercise its countervailing power in order to protect the public. Despite the verbal parallels, government power is in fact power, since individuals do not have a free choice as to whether or not to obey government laws and regulations, while consumers are free to ignore the products marketed by even the biggest and supposedly most powerful corporations in the world.